We're going to look today at 1 Corinthians 9. Now, it's a longer passage, and so um, I'll read the text tonight because again, we're going to look at 1 through 27, and like I said, it's a very lengthy passage. That the title in the NIV, which, by the way, if you're using the Pew Bible, it's page 1780. The title there, I think, gives a really good, accurate description. The rights of an apostle. Paul is talking here about what rights does he have, and can he use those, and if so, why or why not? So that's kind of the bigger picture. I'm going to read through it, and then I'm going to give you, like we've been doing, I'll give you maybe 5 minutes to just go back through and skim through, looking for words that are repeated a number of times, as well as Old Testament references. There's at least one of them in here, and it's maybe not the major one, but see if you can find it anyways as we go through. And then also pay attention as we go through. Pay attention to the bigger structure that Paul is working with here, because even though it's a very long passage, there's kind of a logical flow that goes through all of this. And so try to pay attention to his main argumentation as he builds his case, as it were. And then I'll give you a couple minutes to look at that after we've read through it, and then we'll kind of discuss it and see if we can follow along with what Paul is getting at. So, 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk? Do I say this merely from a human point of view? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because when the plowman plows and the thresher threshes, they ought to do so in the hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who work in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights. And I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such things for me. I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of this boast. Yet when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, for I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make use of my rights in preaching it. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore I do not run like a man running aimlessly. I do not fight like a man beating the air. No, I beat my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. All right, I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, and let's, Haley, go to that second slide there, and go through, and again, you're looking for significant words that are repeated 2, 3 times or more, and just make a note of those mentally. And then look for some of the structure points. See if you can figure out the bigger structure, and if there's any, if you can find the Old Testament passage, I think it stands out a little bit. But anyway, see if you can find that. Take about 5 minutes and go ahead and do that, and then we'll come back together and discuss it. And of course, feel free to talk with others as well. There's no need to just sit in silence and do it. Let's do maybe about 2 more minutes or so. All right, let's come back together, and I think what I want to see if we can do first is just see if you can identify the big structure. If you can break a text down into 3 or 4, especially a big text like this where it all kind of, it's a long section, if we can break it down into 3 or 4 smaller parts. It's a little more manageable that way. So, any thoughts on how you would do that if you see smaller um, divisions in the text? What do you see? Anyone want to take a stab at that? Yeah, David, what do you see? Hmm. Yep. Right. Yep. Yep. And I think I would put that when I looked at that. That's exactly what I did, and I kind of put the end of that. Oh, depending on how you want to argue, that you can maybe do like through about verse 12 or 13. Yeah, I think verse 12, and then verse 13 kind of begins. I think, anyways, another longer section. But I think those first two are right. Did you have more than that? Right. Yeah, they're in, what is it, starting in about verse 23, right? 23, 24. Yeah. Okay, good. And the one thing I would add to that is verses 1 through 3, um, it almost is kind of a preface, because what he's doing there is he's establishing himself as an apostle. He's saying, I know some others don't think I'm really a genuine apostle, but I am, and here's the reason why. I've seen the Lord, and you as a church are fruit of my labor. So he's saying, I really am an apostle. So that's his first thing, and he doesn't spend a lot of time establishing that fact, but he does start with that, because everything else he's going to say is meaningless if he's not really an apostle, because otherwise, he wouldn't have any of these rights. So he starts off saying, I'm an apostle, and here's why. This is my defense. And then he goes on to the bulk of the section. Yeah, Paul. Hmm. Yep, right. 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 Exactly. That's right. Right. That's exactly right. Yeah, there's a whole lot of them in this. I mean, just on and on and on. And rhetorically, that's very powerful, right? And we sometimes will do that in English, right? Didn't I tell you to go and do this? And you're not really asking for a thoughtful answer. You're making a statement, but when you phrase it as a question, you turn it back on the person and you make them give the answer. And that you're right. That's exactly what he's doing here. And he does that, like you said, a whole lot of times, right? Again in verse 8, is it for the oxen that God is concerned? And anyway, so do you not know this? And he's assuming that they know this. You ought to know this. So you're right. There's a lot of that rhetorical oomph in phrasing it that way. So good catch. Yeah. Other thoughts on structure? I think David lays out a pretty workable structure here, but maybe someone else had something a little different. Yeah, Jane. Ah, you're looking for the words? Yeah. Okay. 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 Good. Right. Right. Correct. That's right. Yeah, I think that's a good, and by the way, would be a good homiletical or a good preaching outline, right? The rights, the freedoms, and the discipline. So, um, okay. Yep, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And there's where it's kind of like, you can break the text down in a number of different ways, and depending on how your how big your main points are, you're correct. And they do. That's right. That's right. Okay, good. Yeah, David, and then Jim. Mm-hmm. Right. That's right. Yeah, so that's a good way to put it, right? He sets up this, I could be doing this and I would be legitimate in seeking payment and food and, a spouse, and I could do all these things, but he says my real reward is found in preaching the gospel free of charge, and I don't want anything that's going to get in the way of that. I don't want to claim any right that might hinder that in any way. So he's sort of contrasting what is the reward. In fact, hey, if you put it to the next slide just for just a moment, because David just answered that first question on the left column there. What are the rights that Paul can claim as an apostle? And you read that all in verse 4, right? Food, drink, could take along a spouse if he wants to, payment from the church, right? Comes back to that in where is it? Verse 13, I think it is, right? If you're employed in the temple, you get food from the temple, all that. So he's claiming all of these rights that he can't that he could lay claim to, but he sets it aside in favor of a fruitful ministry. What are some of the other words that you? Oh, Jim, I'm sorry, I was going to come back to you. Yeah, right. That's right. Yeah, and what that is, I mean, that's contextualization. It's knowing your audience and knowing how to fit in to a particular group in order to be able to communicate the gospel clearly there. And missionaries and missiologists spend a lot of time talking about how do we do that? How do we hold on to our core convictions, because those don't change, but how we how we adapt in a culture that should change. So I'll give you an example. My family knows this story, but I was reminded of it again this week because I'm sort of the butt of a joke here. The first time I traveled to Ukraine to do these preaching conferences, I forgot that Ukrainian Baptists really look down on any kind of drinking and any kind of alcohol, right? That's just a big no-no. Now, it wasn't even about me wanting to have a drink. I was using an illustration in a lecture, and the illustration was talking about a drunk preacher, an inebriated preacher who leans on the Bible passage more for support than for illumination. So the illustration is, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but I just, without even thinking about it, I started talking about, the drunk preacher, or the preacher who's like a drunk person who leans on a light pole more for support than illumination. Well, all of a sudden I had a room full of really, really angry Russian or Ukrainian Baptist preachers and I couldn't understand a word they're saying, but I could tell they were yelling at me, and it's fresh in my mind because this week I was talking that over with the person who was there translating that first time. He was translating again this past week, and I said, Sergey, do you remember that? Oh yeah, he says, I remember that well. So, but what is that? That's not knowing your audience, right? That's going into a setting and you just, without thinking, and you don't pay any mind to it, and you're not contextualizing your message, and the consequence of that is that it hinders the ability to promote the gospel. So, what other words do you see repeated that maybe have significance? I think we've hit on the word right. That's woven through this whole text. But what other things do you see? Kara, what did you find? Oh, good. Yep, that's right. You see different words for Jesus. Good job. What else? Yeah, freedom. That's right. Yeah. So rights, and which is kind of a rights and freedoms are sometimes held in tension, right? What do we have the right to claim, and are we, are we free from those, or are we free to claim those? So yeah. What else? Which one is it? Oh, reward. Okay. Yeah, that comes a little later in the text, doesn't it? I'm trying to find. I don't think I highlighted that one, but I remember reading it now, but I don't. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yep, that's right. Yep. Yeah, and so that sets up the idea of what is Paul hoping to get out of this? What is his payment or his reward? Is it the rights that he can claim, or is it? And what he's saying is, no, it's not really that. Even though I could have that, it's the fruit of his ministry and his preaching time. Other words, yeah, prize, same idea. That's right. I, yes, he does. Yes, he does. A lot of personal pronouns, which sometimes you have to always make a judgment call. Is that significant, or is it just sort of the fact of language? But I think in this case, because of the way that he's using those rhetorical questions that Paul pointed out, it does have some significance there. He's really asking about his identity and his role as an apostle. What can he claim for that, for the eye? So, anything else that you notice? Law, you notice if you look at verse 8 and 9, and then again in verse 20 and 20 through 21, the law, and then, right, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And he's careful on how he puts that, isn't he? Because he doesn't just say, the law, that's outdated. We don't need that anymore. We can get rid of it. He says, no, I recognize when I was with people who were Jewish, and he says, even though I'm not under the law in the same way, I still honor that. In fact, that's maybe a good place to ask that question of, did anyone find the Old Testament reference? Yeah, it's the muzzling part, right? And so what? Right. That's right. Yeah, that's maybe not a direct quote, but an allusion that is just as important. And so what he's doing there, again, he's knowing his audience. He's saying, okay, most of you, or a good number of you, are Jewish, and so I'm going to appeal to an authority that you will respect. Because underneath that is sort of the idea, maybe you're not going to respect me, but you know what the Bible says is what he would saying, right? Don't muzzle the law while it's treading out the grain, which is really a way of saying, let the oxen eat while they're working, right? If they're working, you've got to make sure to feed them. That's really all that is his saying there. And then the same thing with the temple service. So the old, Paul's really saying this is an idea that's all the way back in the beginning of Scripture, that you get rewarded or you get paid for the work that you do. Okay, let me see if there are. I think we've covered a lot of those first questions there. Yeah. So what's in all of this? What's Paul's greater concern? Why bother get into all this stuff about the rights and that he has and could claim but doesn't? What is Paul really after here? What's he really trying to emphasize? Do you think? Right. That's right. Yeah, and I think also if you go back to verse 19, that idea is similar there as well. I'm free from all, but I make myself a servant of all, so that I might win more of them. Right? All along, Paul's driving motivation is that the gospel is proclaimed, that people hear it in a way that will be least, that they'll be least hindered, and that it will produce then that fruit. And so, Paul, go ahead. Yeah, right. Right. That's right. That's a contrast, it seems, right? It seems he's saying I'm free, but I'm also a slave. And that fits with the bigger picture of what the gospel really means. It does not mean, hey, we're free so we can do whatever we want. It's free from sin so that we might be a slave of Christ. Like Paul, he uses language that is that emphatic, a slave of Christ. And the only way we can be slaves of Christ is if we're liberated from bondage into sin, right? We're either slaves to sin or slaves to Christ. We're not slaves are freed from sin so we can be autonomous, and that's Paul's underlying idea here. He says, I'm a slave to Christ, and so whatever is going to serve Christ's ultimate interest that's my motivation, is what Paul's saying. Yeah, David. Right? right. That's right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. That's a good point. So his main driving passion is the gospel. Whether or not the church is going to really be receptive, and like David points out, they've been kind of critical of Paul, and they don't want to hear his whole message. But he says, "My ultimate allegiance is to Christ." Let me ask you a question. Verse 20 through 22. That's that section to the Jews. I come as a Jew to win the Jews, and so on and so forth. What do you think? What do you think that kind of contextualization looks like today? Where do we have to practice that today? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Besides standing with Ukrainian Baptists and avoiding talk about drinking, can you think of other examples? Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. Finish the thought. I like where you're going with that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. 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 If you're doing inner city ministry in Portland, are you going to be able to fight tattoos at every corner? Right. I mean, no, right? You're not. You're going to contextualize it, and you're going to say, look, those are secondary issues of whatever your personal preference may be. You have to understand your audience, right? And so it becomes a thing of trying to look past some of those things and not even say, hey, maybe these aren't a good idea or whatever it might look like, right? But that's an example I think gets at it, right? Whenever you're trying to minister to any group of people, you have to ask what are the things here that are preferences and what are the things that are absolutes. Right? Right. 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 Well, right. So there you made a good illustration because it goes both ways. Um, I suspect if I showed up next week with lots of piercings and tattoos, I might raise a couple of eyebrows on that. I probably won't do that, but because contextually that's not quite where Sunny Slope Church is. Now, if I showed up the way I usually dress in a small inner city kind of church, I would look out of place there, right? So a simple idea, but there's the principle of how do we know our audience well and then contextualize the gospel and hmm right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, good. Put more holes and markings on your body. Yeah. Any other thoughts on how do you contextualize? How do we need to contextualize ourselves in this world that often is so different from us? Yeah, Cheryl. Oh, okay.